We pray, Lord, tonight, mindful of Brian and Michelle Cooper. Please heal Brian. All right, so I'm excited. We're going to slow down a little bit tonight as we get into, you can see we are in the two kind of, I don't know, what color would you call this? Is this indigo? Purpley, bluey? I don't know, somewhere in there. These ones. We're going to be in Job chapter 28 and then really Job 28 to 31. So we just have 4 chapters ahead of us tonight. And it's cool, like this is the center of the book. I remember when we looked over the overview, Jesse asked a good question. In Hebrew poetry, there is a structure called the chiasm or chiasm. And it builds to a point. It's like it's how things are organized. And the center of it is the most, is the pivot point, is the most kind of important part of it. And Job chapter 28 is the center of this book. And it seems like there's good reason to see that structure in the book of Job. And it is the unique part of this book. It's hard to even tell who's talking, if it is Job or if it is the narrator or the writer of the book speaking. So all that to say, let's just jump right into this, looking at Job chapter 28. And yes, let's read. Actually, I think it'd be good for us to read the whole chapter. Can I get 3 volunteers to read from Job 28 for us? Split it up into 3 sections. Roger, do you want to read verses 1 through 11? Can I get someone to read verses 12 through 22? Dave? And then Ricky, do you want to finish us off in 23 through 28? Perfect. Roger, whenever you're ready.
Surely there is a mine for silver and a place where they refine gold. Iron is taken from the dust and copper is smelted from rock. Man puts an end to darkness, and to the farthest limit he searches out the rock in gloom and deep shadow. He sinks a shaft far from habitation, forgotten by the foot. They hang and swing to and fro, far from men. The earth, from it comes food, and underneath it is turned up as fire. Its rocks are the source of sapphires, and its dust contains gold. The path no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud beasts have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. He puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. He hews out channels through the rocks, and his eye sees anything precious. He dams up the streams from flowing, and what is hidden he brings out to the light.
But where can wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. The deep says, "It is not in me," and the sea says, "It is not with me." Pure gold cannot be given in exchange for it, nor can silver be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold or glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for articles of fine gold. Coral and crystal are not to be mentioned, and the acquisition of wisdom is above that of pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Where does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? Thus it is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the sky.
Good. And then Ricky, 22 through the end of the chapter, please.
Destruction and death say, we have heard a report about it with our ears. God understands its way, and he knows its place. And he looks to the ends of the earth, and he sees under the whole heavens to establish a weight for the wind and apportion the waters by measure. when he made a law from the rain and a path from the thunderbolt, then he said, saw wisdom and declared it. He prepared it. Indeed, he searched it out. And to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding.
Awesome. This is a really, it's a unique chapter, like I said, in the pages of Job. And it's fascinating. It doesn't sound like anything else. I mean, I guess I'm repeating myself and being redundant, But it's, Job speaks before it and Job speaks after it. So some people will say this is Job writing, but it really seems like this might just be in the middle of the book as almost a comment on the rest, on what's happened so far and what's been going on. But that being said, what picture do you see used to contrast the search for wisdom in the first 11 verses? And how does that help us appreciate the value of wisdom? In these first 11 verses, what is the picture used to describe the value and the search for wisdom? Go ahead.
He uses priceless things that we can put a price on it, and it's really extravagant.
Yeah. So these are extravagant,
Silver.
very precious things. And go ahead, Roger.
What stands out to me is how hard people look for that stuff.
Yeah.
They're willing to dig to the deepest deeps, through the hardest rock, going to the far ends of the earth to find these small, precious little things. But none of that is spiritual. None of that is wisdom. It might help them to lead a decent life once they have all that wealth, but it's not going to help them in the important matters. And I think when Job is looking at his friends and the arguments that they've made, they make some good points about God, but their focus is so materialistic, so in this world. I think this is a point where God, Job, the narrator, whoever we want to attribute it to, is trying to show this is where the mistake is.
Yeah.
The mistake is looking at all these material things. Why do they think Job is evil? Because bad things happen to him. How short-sighted is that?
Yeah.
And somehow Job is able to keep his integrity, and I think that's because his mind is on that true wisdom and that place after this life.
Yeah, amen. I mean, that's so well put. That's exactly where all this is going. And so, to Roger's point, you said some of this, and Ricky, you made this point as well. How does this, the mining for it and the preciousness of the things mined for, how does this help us appreciate the value of wisdom? I mean, what does this imply, or what does this tell us about the value of wisdom? Hard to get. It's worth a lot, right? And, it's just, this is becoming, we'll see more about this. We'll discuss more about this, but I think this is an interesting place to start with this chapter. Mark?
Also, men make these great efforts to find these gems and stones. Well, you can't just find wisdom.
Yeah. That's the next question, right? Where can it be found? Do you see where it says where wisdom can be found? Yeah. Man does not, where is the place? There's a question, kind of, right? Even death and Abaddon, verse 23. With our ears, we have heard a report of it. Even in death, we're like, well, we've heard about it. I don't know if we can pinpoint it for you. Sometimes I feel like this is how a lot of things in my house are, and then Haley always knows where they end up being. But I swear I looked where she looked, but it just wasn't there. And I think that's kind of the point of this, right? Like, it's just not where we thought it was. Like, nowhere, no one can find it. And it can't be found in all these places. Like it says, even the eagle eyes can't find it, right? The bird of prey hasn't seen it. And so these questions are a little redundant, but it's just so fascinating. And not only is it, we know where to find gold and stones, and and when we know, we mine out the hills, right? The gold rushes we see in history and whatnot. And even in this book, you see, in this chapter, you see he says these stones are found here, and the gold is found here, and all these places we know where to go, and we dig deep for them. Wisdom, we don't even know where to start. We don't know where to go. And if we did, there's a question, would we even value it appropriately to find it there if we knew? Will we put the effort required? And so it's a really, I think, just a beautiful chapter that challenges us to meditate and to think about the place of wisdom again. Because we can't forget where Job falls in the place of the Bible. I was reading something today that's described it this way. Proverbs is like a monologue on wisdom. It's just like, here's wisdom, here it is, just one voice. You don't challenge the voice, you don't argue with the voice, you say, yes, this is true, and you'll find wisdom that way. Job is a dialogue on wisdom. It's an argument. And I think this is helpful to us because we get to see kind of both sides, and Job never comments on what's right or wrong. At the beginning, we know that Job is blameless, and so we have a rubric to compare or to test everything said against. We know Job's blameless, we know God's pleased with him. So if anything doesn't stack up to that, we know this isn't lining up. But we have to listen to this conversation, and next week we'll look at Elihu's speeches. Very, very smart people are torn about Elihu, what to make of him. Is he a good guy? Is he right? Or is he wrong? Does he help Job? Or does he make it even worse? And this is the beauty of Job, is that we don't have a comment from God on Elihu. We have to figure it out. And so Proverbs is kind of this monologue. Ecclesiastes isn't a monologue or a dialogue. It's kind of a critique of wisdom. And then Job is like a dialogue. We have 42 chapters of people arguing with each other, which I think is the beauty of it, is that we can see in this. This is how wisdom is really tested in our lives. Because when we look around, what did we have last night on television? We had a vice presidential debate, right? We still do this. We put people up who we think are the worthiest candidates, and we say, well, which one, we hold them side by side, which one do I want? Which one is right? And this is kind of what Job does. These are supposed to be like the 4 or 5 smartest guys in the world at the time. And we get to see them kind of duke it out about wisdom. And I think part of the point of this chapter of Job chapter 28 is just pointing out that all these guys fall short, that their wisdom isn't even enough, even though they are the wisest guys around. And this ought to kind of put a fear into us, not just a fear of God like where it ends. I guess that's the next question, right? But also it ought to put a fear into us that we are maybe a lot more foolish, a lot less wise than we'd like to think we are. Because Job is blameless and perfect in wisdom, and yet he still can't comprehend the world around him very well, at least at this point in time. And so I think this chapter is it's almost like it goes on a long time. It's a long poem about this. It seems like, okay, I get the point. But I think the length and kind of the meditative quality of it is to make us reflect on the rest of the book and think, what are you thinking about wisdom? Because sometimes we can be pretty quick to judge Job's 3 friends. Oh, these guys, they're so wrong. They're so dumb. They don't get it. It's like, all right, if that's how you want to read it, then you're not going to glean actually what I think Job is trying to tell us, is that this is us a lot of times. Anyway, that's my little aside on this. So as he finishes this poem, how does it end? This poem, Man's Search for Wisdom. What's the conclusion? And where else in the Bible does it make you think of? So here's the last few verses. God understands its way. He knows its place. Talks about creation. And in verse 28, and to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. What do you think of this conclusion, and where else in the Bible does it make you think of? Roger, and then Jesse. Well, Ricky and Jesse.
When you look at it, what he's saying is after all that, God knows where all the riches are. Mm-hmm. But when we get to this point, he's telling you where wisdom can be found.
Yeah.
And he's saying, behold, the fear of the Lord. We can recognize that from Proverbs.
Yeah.
Fear of the Lord and to depart from evil understanding. If we want to go to the New Testament, what were the 2 greatest commands, thank you, that Jesus brought forth? To fear God and love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
To depart from evil is understanding.
Yeah.
If they were not his friends, if they were not so busy trying to justify themselves and actually thought about what was necessary, what was important, how God would want them to act, would we have had the vehemence that we have seen in these arguments?
Yeah.
They keep upping the ante because it's not about Job anymore. It's about them proving they're right and him wrong. And that's where they lost all part of spirituality. And this, of course, is how easy it is and how very difficult it is to gain wisdom.
Yes. Well put. Rick, and then Jesse over here.
When we look at Solomon, in Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, when he talks about wisdom and where to seek it, and at the end of the conclusion is seek God and keep keep his commandments. All those that are mentioned in the Hall of Fame of the faithful, I call Hebrews 11. All those names that are mentioned, all these faithful individuals, at times that when they faltered, they always knew that God had a plan that you had to dig to get wisdom, to understand his wisdom. You may not understand it all, and you're not supposed to, but you know enough to keep your faith in God.
Yeah.
Through everything.
Yeah, and to live that out, right?
And
That-
live it.
Yeah, yeah, well put, well put. Jesse, and then we'll push on ahead.
I think that saying, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. The fear of the Lord is a really complex statement. I think there's a lot of layers that you can dig into on what that means, of course. And we've talked about it for most of our lives, I believe. Once you're a Christian, you start talking about this. But it's like, it seems like it's an intersection of an emotional state and a relational understanding, like a relationship understanding. And where those two lines cross, that is the fear of the Lord. To dissect that, it's not straightforward, and it's not like, here's the answer. Okay, now what does that mean? But you know that you do understand it when the result is that you depart from evil, right? Because that's what demonstrates that you understand the wisdom and that you're executing it, right? So it's really an interesting place to be. So I'll just throw that out there. We could talk about it forever.
Yeah. It's so fascinating because every answer falls short. We'll read this and we'll say, well, he's certainly not talking about trembling fear and this place. God doesn't want us to live in a place of constant anxiety. And yet, when God shows up in this book, it's pretty fearful. It's pretty anxiety-inducing. God comes in the whirlwind as a mighty kind of cosmic warrior and says, y'all got it wrong for the most part, And so there is some of this, but there also is throughout it that there is a warmth and a relational, like you pointed out, quality to fearing the Lord that is also awe and reverential, that is supposed to draw us into a closer, tighter, more affectionate bond with God. And that is those two kind of poles are what fear of the Lord is found in tension through. Is you have to, if you ever get too far from the idea that God is a fearful being that could undo us, then you're not going to really fear him like you ought to. But if you overemphasize that to the lack of how warm and loving and the quality of the relationship he desires to have with us, as evidenced in Jesus dying for us on the cross first and foremost, then you'll also miss it because you'll not appreciate that fearing God is also how we have to reverence how loving he is too, and that ought to cause us to fear in a different way. How awesome it is! How amazing! How could someone love like this? And when you're faced, has someone ever given you a gift that is so thoughtful and so perfect and so intimately about who you are that you just feel almost embarrassed? You're how could I ever repay this gift? How could I ever give a gift to this person that would even come close? I have a friend, I hate him for it. He's just he has this uncanny ability to give the perfect gift, and he's done it 4 or 5 times. Just randomly a package will show up at my house. I'm dude, you gotta quit this. Because it makes you... Is it coffee? No, it's not coffee. It's they're these things that are they're jokes and these things that just kind of perfectly articulate a lot of my personality. I feel only he knows. And every time I have no idea how to respond to this, because nothing is adequate. And I think that's the other end of this, that it's so awesome how loving God is that it ought to kind of make us feel that void all the more, And those things balance each other out perfectly. There's so much to say here, and I know I saw a lot of hands. I do want to keep moving. I want to point out these 2 things here. He's going to creation, so we ought to think about Genesis 1 and 2 here. And he also, we've already gone to great measure to point out, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To depart from evil is understanding. And through this all, we've kind of had this discussion that Job 28 is placed specifically in the book. It's the center of the book, and it comes after all of his friends' speeches are done. And it really comments on all the discussions so far, even as comment on Job to some extent. And so when you look at these ideas, where can wisdom be found? It doesn't say with Zophar and Bildad and Eliphaz, does it? It doesn't say with, hey, Job's 3 friends, they're getting it right, The idea is that man doesn't know its value, nor is it found. It's not even found in the land of the living, and it's not found in the land of the dead either. This is there's something here where it's they're all supposed to be left. until the final verse. Like, where is it found? And that's kind of the question this book is bringing us to. Have you ever listened to debates? I'm not talking about the one on TV last night, although it applies, but like just listen to people talking who are supposed to be smart, and you're like, nobody knows anything. And we're just left sometimes fumbling and feeling like there are no answers. Like I think we have this tendency, at least maybe it's just me, to look around to someone to look up to and to put my hopes in and my faith in and say, I can trust this. And the part of the point of Job is saying, there's nobody. Exactly. There's no person you can put your faith in. Outside of Jesus Christ and God himself, there's nothing. And this is something we have to constantly wrestle with. And it's part of, I think, the tirelessness of life in this world. Is that we're always looking for a place or a person or a thing that we can kind of just be like, oh, here, finally, I can set everything on this shelf, and here it will stay. The right counselor, the right book, the right self-help, whatever it is, and all of it falls short. And all of that ought to make us long for and look to our God all the more and our fear of him. That's the point of this chapter, I believe, in the center of this book. And in some senses, that's the point of the book of Job. And so all the dialogues that we've read and all the dialogues we're going to continue to read, especially when God shows up later in the book, this is the point. It's going to make this point emphatically as the book goes on. It's already made it in the negative sense. It will continue to make it in the negative sense more, but God himself will positively make it, and we'll see how the book wraps up after that. So that's Job 28. I think it's just something we cannot take lightly in the center of this book. But then as the book goes on, we also have to do with these few chapters where Job gives his final speech. And he starts to kind of describe his former life and his reputation in Job 29. Did you guys notice as you read Job 29, how does Job describe his former life and his reputation? What was it like? I know. I love it. Mine says butter, I think. Yeah, my steps were bathed in butter. It's the same idea, right? And rock poured out for me streams of oil. It's just like everything is smooth sailing, and yeah, it's like the idea of milk and honey. It's just like everything was going my way, right, Roger?
It's very much like the devil's accusation. You've built a hedge around him. Mm-hmm. That blessing of being right with God, of knowing what God wanted, knowing what he had to do, and now he's in this confusion. Mm-hmm. And so I could see him, missing that the most. Mm-hmm. Me being in your favor, because they, even though they've had nothing but wrong complaints, have convinced him that he's being punished in some way by God.
Yeah. So you start to look at this first blessing that Job laments. Look here in the first few verses. Job took his discourse up again and said, "Oh, that I were as months gone by, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in the prime of my days, when the friendship of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, and my children were around me." What's the first blessing that Job misses in all this loss? What'd you say? His family is at the end of this, right? But even before that, his relationship with God. Yeah, and it's right. His family's right there after. I mean, he's not a careless man. He's mourning the loss of his children, to be sure. But what's amazing about Job is that even more than that, he mourns the loss of his relationship with God. And this is striking. We made this point earlier in the book, but it's well to make it again. That one of the things that points out the beauty of Job's faithfulness and his relationship with God, the quality of it, is that what his biggest loss in his life was the fact that he believed that God didn't care for him anymore. And that shook him. I mean, that shook him more than losing his kids. I mean, that's unbelievable. That is unbelievable. And for many of us, we have to ask ourselves, if we lost everything, including our families, including our kids, our closest relationships, would we mourn that more than feeling like God wasn't happy with us? Or we say, well, whatever, he did this to me, who cares about him? Curse God and die, right? Maybe we wouldn't say that extreme, but we might say something similar to that. We're like, I can't believe, that.
Well, it's interesting how he must be totally isolated from God. He cannot perceive the fact that it's like Job is the center of God's attention right now. God is scrutinizing him closely and watching ever so closely. He's right there, and yet he has no idea of that. He feels totally abandoned.
Yeah. And it's just amazing to me that what the center of it is this abandonment is even a greater loss to him than the loss of his kids. And I know I'm making this point, and I've already made it, but we have to see this, because this is one of the other main points of Job is that the question, does Job serve God for nothing? And Job proves that's not the case. Job serves God just to serve God, for the beauty of that relationship, for the love of that. And in a sense, you could ask questions like this: would you still be a Christian if God wouldn't send you to heaven at the end of it? Like, if you didn't get to go to heaven, would you still be a Christian just to serve God for the serving God of it, for knowing him and being known by him? That's kind of the question Job asks. And we'll see in the New Testament things framed like this, where Paul himself, when he talks about his Jewish brothers in Romans 9, would say, I wish that I were accursed, separated from God, so that they could be saved. Have you ever said something like that? Ever thought something like that? Would you give up your salvation for anybody else? To Job, nothing was worth more than being close to God. There was no reward in it for him, in a sense. He just wanted to serve God because he loved God. And that's why this book is so challenging for us, because we have to wrestle with the fact that this guy existed and that he makes me look bad. Because it's easy to sway me in a day from putting God first. I can get caught up in the minutia of just day-to-day life, having a family, having a job, having all these things. What matters to me, looking forward to the weekend when I can just do whatever I want. And I can just live my life for me. Let alone Job, who loses everything and still wants to love God more than anything. And this is that more than anything else. This is a heavy thing to wrestle with. And we can't miss the point that he makes. This first blessing he misses the most is that he feels like he's not a friend of God anymore. And that breaks his heart. And I think there's more to say about this. We need to keep going. Was there a hand over here? Chase?
If Jesus never rose, then we are to be the most pitied.
Sure.
As Paul puts it.
Yeah, that's well put here.
And also, I was just thinking that we get a taste of it also when we sin, because, I mean, I'm sure we can think about a time when we screwed up something big, and then felt like we haven't repented yet, like we haven't prayed for forgiveness yet, and how empty you feel in that moment, because you've severed that connection, like you've turned your back on God, right? And I mean, for Job, he feels like God turned his back on him, but that sense of disconnect, though, like that we feel through sin, is just a taste of what this is, I think.
Yeah. Job was truly experiencing hell on earth. I mean, all the pictures of hell is that it's defined by the fact that God isn't there and that we're not close to him. And this is the beauty of suffering here, is that it gives us a taste of what life is like without him. Not to be like neener, but to remind us of the significance. And Job felt that. So when you look at this chapter, why did Job have such a good reputation? Did you notice this? What defined his life? You can see it especially in verses 12 through 17. Does someone want to read these for us? Can I get a volunteer to read these? Go ahead, Greg.
It says, because I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the one ready to perish came upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I investigated the case which I did not know. I broke the jaws of the wicked and snatched the prey from his teeth.
Thanks, Greg. So why did Job have such a good reputation?
He was everything that God entails that he wants us to do.
Yeah.
Wants us to be.
Yes.
To look out for others.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's it for him.
Yeah.
And us as well. It's,
you know what's fun? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What's funny for me is I read the start of this book, and I'm like, man, Job was so righteous. He made those sacrifices for his kids. Like, that's what defined, like, that's to me, like, that makes it. Job looks back on his past life, and he says, I was righteous because I cared for people. And we do well to hear this, all right? That God's righteousness is both. Both those things are a part of God's righteousness. And I think what's funny, you can look at how Christians at large today talk about righteousness or justice. It can even get into terms of social justice sometimes. And sometimes we can look down at the other definitions of righteousness, but God's righteousness enfolds all of that. And we have to be careful that we're not too siloed in our perspectives on righteousness, because Job was righteous for the way he sacrificed and worshiped God. But he was also righteous because of the way he took care of people. And because of how he looked out for people. I mean, when you think about these ideas, the orphan who had no helper and the widow's heart singing for joy, any verses pop to mind? James chapter 1. True religion and undefiled is in the sight of God. But, yeah. And then you can say other things, right? What about verse 14? I put on righteousness and it clothed me. Does that sound like anything? All the descriptions of Jesus, his armor, the breastplate of righteousness, that was his armor that we're supposed to wear now. Or like Isaiah 59, looking forward to Jesus, saying he put on righteousness. And we look at Jesus' life. Who did he take care of? How did he take care of people? I mean, he was righteous to God. He was faithful and he was worshipful, but he also was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. He was a father to the needy. He would break the jaws of the wicked. All these things to find Jesus as well. And these comments about Job's reputation, about what made him righteous, it's not like he earned it, but this definition of his life shows that he was close to God because he cared about things that God cared about. God cares about people who aren't doing well. And we praise him for that. When it's us who isn't doing well, when I'm not doing well, I'm so grateful that God cares about someone like that. And when I'm doing well and someone else isn't, I'm like, well, hey, glad you have God, or glad someone else can take care of you. It's not my problem. And what's beautiful about Job's life is his days were bathed in butter and cream. Part of it was that he knew that what he would do is he cared about these things and he saw to them. And again, I find myself acutely challenged by these ideas. And I find myself not relating so much to Job here as much as I would like that to be true. And so I think, again, we have to do well to pay attention that it's not just like, hey, Job was a pretty good guy. It's like, no, this was his life. And God says, yeah, that's right. Because Job cared about these things, God saw that and said, yeah, Job's right on. These things do matter to me. And Job's precious to me because of the way he cares about these things like I do. It's challenging. Any thoughts about this? Go ahead, Gene.
Well, it's amazing how exactly it epitomizes the first two commandments that Jesus talked about.
Yeah.
Love God above all, but love man second, most of all. And he just epitomizes that. But the law also does too. It's exactly what the law teaches, and that is to take care of people.
Yeah.
Make relationships the most strongest thing on earth.
Yes. Yeah. This is what God wants. And again, this starts to make all sorts of points about when people talk about God, like the atheist agnostic world talks about God. Oh, you need a God to tell you what to do, or you need God to make you right. And it's like, yeah, I kind of do, actually. I do need help. Because as much as I think of myself as wanting to be a good person and needing to be a good person, I also know that I can't do that on my own. I fall so short every single day. And so reading stuff like this and reading God's word in general, how much he's always cared about this, even the harder things about God that are hard for me to understand, the suffering of Job or the God of the Old Testament, it falls secondary to the fact that this is what God's always preached and what God's always wanted me to live up to and tries to help us live up to. And he cares about it more than anybody else does. And so we ought to care about it to that same degree. And these things are very challenging, right? Jesse and Ricky?
Yeah, it's just Matthew 25, and when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And Jesus says, of course, as you did it to the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Exactly here.
Yeah, amen. And Ricky?
I think sometimes, like Job, when we're put in dire situations, and just like we lose sight of who we should be, even when we're going through the hardness, the challenges, the whatever category, whatever, wherever you've been or wherever you are. And above all, keep your tongue best you can. Always look out for somebody else, because somebody else is going to have it a lot worse than you got it. And like you said, challenging. Wow, is it challenging?
Yeah.
Especially when you're going through something. And that's the key. And I'm convinced that's why this book of Job is here.
Yeah.
Because when we're going through something, we can, man, I can't tell you how many times it's like, Job.
Yeah.
That guy was amazing.
Yeah. It makes you realize the choices you have in the times where you feel powerless, right?
And you're going to feel it. You're going to feel it.
Yeah.
And if you haven't, you will.
Yes. Yes. All right. I want to keep moving. There's still a little more to cover because as he starts to talk about chapter 29, into chapter 30, he talks about how horrible everything's going. You know, chapter 29, everything used to be this way, and now everything's this way. And how does that help? How do these like high highs and low lows help illustrate Job's misery? And look at how he describes it, his mindset, particularly in these verses, chapter 30, 24 through 31. He says, "Yet does not one in a heap of ruin stretch out his hand, or in his disaster therefore cry out for help? Have I not wept for the one whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? When I expected good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. I'm seething within and cannot relax. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning without comfort. I stand up in the assembly and cry out for help. I have become a brother to jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black on me and my bones burn with fever. Therefore my harp is turned to mourning and my flute to the sound of those who weep." His days were bathed in butter and cream, right? Like everything was smooth and beautiful and it was right. It was good. And now he's saying everything I thought and expected, it's all turned out sour. It's all dark. I'm seething within. There's no comfort, just anxiety. I'm a brother and a companion to jackals and ostriches, animals of the wild, you know. I have no home, no place to lay my head. My skin is turning black. My bones are burning. Everything is changing and decaying. And so after this, Job makes a request in chapter 31 in many ways. He looks at specifics, right? If I've done this, then do this to me. If I've done this, then do that. Did you read this chapter? What's the point Job's making to God? What's kind of the general request in chapter 31 as you read it? He says, if I've walked with falsehood, let God weigh me with accurate scales and let God know my integrity. If my step has turned from the way, if my heart has been enticed by a woman, if I have despised the claim. What's he saying here? If I've sinned, then tell me. This is the conclusion of his speech. He's saying, God, look, if I've done these things, if I'm so worthy of this punishment, then just show me. Please, at this point, I just want to know where I went wrong. I want things to be made right. And when you go through chapter 31, and he says stuff like, I made a covenant with my eyes. How could I gaze at a virgin? You know, if I've walked with falsehood, all these things he goes through. And the point is, he hasn't done any of these things. It reminds me of Matthew 5, where we would read how the Pharisees read the law and say, well, as long as I don't kill anybody, I'm good. And Job says, I've made a covenant that I'm going to be right with everybody. I'm not even going to look at somebody the wrong way. If I haven't treated my servants with the utmost respect, then I deserve this. And he's like, just show me where I've been wrong. And I guess when we start thinking, how does this help us appreciate what righteousness might mean for us? What could you write as your Job 31? God, if I've done this, what haven't I done? What haven't you done? Right? And I'm not saying this to say like we should list out all our sins and shame ourselves into oblivion. But the point I'm making is that Job lived this life and it was important to him to hold himself to this standard. And it didn't earn his salvation, didn't earn anything. But the point I'm trying to make is that he valued these things so much that he lived them out. That he made it led him to this character. And when he goes through chapter 31 and says, God, if I've been wrong in any of these ways, then I would deserve this punishment. The implication is he didn't deserve the punishment because he didn't live like that. And it just makes us question, how do I define righteousness for myself? You know, how often am I willing to let myself off the hook? Well, it's been a long week, Ben. You know, like everyone would understand if you weren't perfect today, you know, here's a justification. Other people haven't treated me right. Why should I treat, you know, like whatever it is. And Job makes this point saying, listen, like, I haven't lived like that. And Job kind of holds our feet to the fire about our own kind of inadequate definitions of righteousness. Not that he's perfect, but he does challenge us to re-evaluate what righteousness might look like. Roger, I know we just have time for one comment.
I just want to read verse 14. What then could I do when God arises and when he calls me to account? What will I answer him?
Yeah.
So even though he suffered and endured all of this diatribe from his friends, lost that place with God, but then what is his answer? If I'd done any of those things, what would I say to God?
Yeah.
So maybe if we were going to examine ourselves, what would my excuses be, and would they hold any water?
Yeah.
Anyway, like verse 14.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to point out, because that's what he cared about, right? It's his relationship with God again. So as he ends this section, or near the end of this section, what do you think of these verses? When he says, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me, and the indictment which my adversary has written. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it to myself like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him." What do you think of these verses? Yeah, this is where he maybe goes too far, right? But it's interesting when you look at these verses. Again, Job makes says these things to remind us, like one to hear him, carrying the indictment on his shoulders. Does it make you think of anything? It turns me again to Jesus, right? And Job and his righteousness and his suffering and his pleas. How do all these things look forward to Jesus in the gospel? How do they find their place in what Jesus did for us?
Emphasizes our need for a mediator.
Yeah, again, and Job has done this, and he will do this, does this more. He emphasizes our need for a mediator. How else does this connect to the good news, to the gospel? Maria?
Both of them had a relationship to God.
What was the first part you said again?
Both Job and Jesus Christ himself had a relationship to God the Father.
Yeah, they did. They both had this relationship to God that was precious to them, right? Good. What else? Any other ways that you see the gospel or see Jesus Christ in Job here? And not just these 3 verses, but maybe in this whole section we've been looking at.
Well, Jesus had to carry his own cross on his shoulders.
Yeah.
And yet he was righteous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's kind of there's an echo of that in this, right? Where it's like the bearing of sins that weren't his, he's bearing the brunt of it. And Job's feeling that. And not that Job is perfect like Jesus, but there is something where what's happening to him feels unjust, right? And so all of this, there's this big problem in the world. It is one of the complaints, or one of the arguments against God, that there is suffering and pain in a world that is run by an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving God. And maybe we found ourselves in that place where we wonder, God, how can you let this go on? How can you let me suffer and squalor and all the pains on around me? And God's answer is succinct and unbelievable. He said, I came down and lived a perfect life for you, so that whenever you mess up, any of the sins you've committed, you have a place for them, and you can still be close to me. I've done everything to die for you, and this is what the gospel does. And so when Job says all these things, and we find ourselves in places like Job, whatever that might mean, where we find the pains and the brokenness of this world really hitting us where we live in our homes and our hearts, we can remember that these things Job said looked forward to Jesus Christ, and the pains we suffer and the problems we have with the pains around us remind us to look back to Jesus Christ and remember what he did that he's going to make things right once again. And it kind of, I think, galvanizes our need to be faithful and hopeful and committed in our relationship to him. And Job makes that point in spades as well. That's wisdom, right? That's the fear of the Lord. And I think that's how Job preaches the gospel, in fact. So that's a good place to wrap up for tonight. We'll continue on in chapters 32 to 37. There's questions up here for next week. And I appreciate you all. That's it for class tonight.